Hello and welcome to Bound by Oath, a podcast on constitutional history brought to you by the Institute for Justice's Center for Judicial Engagement. I'm John Ross, and this is the second half of our presentation on the government's power of eminent domain. If you missed the first half, please do back up and give a listen to our previous episode, episode 7, entitled The Despotic Power. When we left off, the era of urban renewal had come to a close. Over 1,200 cities had used the power of eminent domain and federal funding to seize and demolish entire neighborhoods that were said to be blighted, forcing hundreds of thousands of people out of house and home.
With financial help from the federal government, the city was to buy and clear the land and then rebuild the area. But as it turned out, it wasn't quite that simple.
But even though the federal government pulled the plug on the urban renewal program, the Supreme Court ruling that allowed for it, Berman v. Parker, was still good law. Federal funds were and are still allowed to go to projects that use eminent domain for private redevelopment through other programs. And the state laws that allowed for those projects were still on the books. And many states were pushing the envelope even further by allowing municipalities to take property where there was not even a pretense of blight.
The question in the case is whether a city's taking of private property for the purpose of economic development satisfies the public use requirement of the Fifth Amendment.
And in 2005, in the case of Kelo v. New London, the Supreme Court was asked, is that constitutional? Can cities take even property that no one thinks is blighted simply because officials can imagine a use for the land that they think would be better?
The city expected that the plan would create new jobs, increase tax and other revenues, and improve the area's recreational opportunities.
By a vote of 5-4, the court said yes. The majority said that the city of New London, Connecticut, had thoroughly deliberated and carefully produced an integrated development plan that promised thousands of new jobs and millions of dollars of new tax revenues.
One of the main things we argued was that those promises were completely empty in New London. There was overwhelming evidence that none of that was going to happen. And the Kelo majority said, we're not going to check. The city thought maybe the project could happen, and that's a public use.
In the view of the 4 dissenters, the ruling meant that the Fifth Amendment's requirement that a taking be for a public use had been erased from the Constitution. But the majority disagreed with that, and on this episode, we'll talk about what it said was left.
You have one private entity that went to the government and said, please give me the property that belongs to that other private entity. And the government said, okay. So this tees up exactly the question that was left open by Kelo of what counts as a pretextual taking. And it also opens an opportunity for the Supreme Court just to say, you know what, Kelo was wrong in the first place.
We'll talk about the public backlash against Kelo, which saw 47 states change their laws or constitutions to provide more, although not always sufficient, protections for property owners. Plus, we'll talk about several current cases that will give the courts the opportunity to enforce those reforms, to push back against both Kelo and Berman, and to restore traditional limits on the government's power of eminent domain.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
I, Elena Kagan.
I, Brett M. Kavanaugh.
I, Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Do solemnly swear
that I will administer justice
without respect to persons
and do equal right to the poor and the rich.
to the poor and to the rich.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
that I will well and faithfully
Discharge and perform.
The duties
Of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
As we talked about on the last episode, since the founding, in case after case, lawsuit after lawsuit, judges have written that the power of eminent domain cannot be used to transfer property from person A to person B merely for person B's private use. Per the Fifth Amendment, a taking must be for a public use. But in 1954, in the case of Berman v. Parker, the Supreme Court adopted a novel and very expansive test for what counts as a public use. In the past, public use meant that the property was going to be owned or used by the public after it was taken. In Berman, however, The court said that ultimately what happens with the land is not necessarily the focus. Instead, if the taking itself, the mere act of taking property from A, is for some kind of public purpose, anything that could be plausibly intended to improve the public welfare, then that's a public use, even if the property is then transferred to B for private use. Eliminating slums and blight was a public purpose, and so the fact that property would be given to private developers afterward was entirely incidental. That was a radical change. Then, in 1984, the Supreme Court applied the new public purpose test in an entirely different context, in the case of Hawaii Housing Authority v. Midkiff.
We'll hear arguments next in Hawaii Housing Authority against Midkiff.
In Hawaii, about half of all land was owned by the state or federal government, and most of the other half was owned by just 72 private landowners who traced their ownership back prior to statehood when Hawaii was still a monarchy. What that meant by the 1960s was that homeowners in the state would own their houses, but they had to rent the land underneath in 40 or 50-year leases. Eventually, the state legislature decided that having so much land concentrated in so few hands was causing a housing crisis.
And it found specifically that this land oligopoly would not just naturally fade away, that it would keep forcing up land prices and the cost of living generally, with grave economic and social consequences for the entire state, unless the oligopoly was somehow broken up by law.
So the state passed a law allowing the owners of single-family homes, but not any other kinds of properties, to ask the state to condemn the land under their homes and then have the title transferred to them. A straight transfer from A to B.
The act relies on a state agency, the Hawaii Housing Authority, to decide whether or not condemning all or part of the tract in question would serve the public purpose of creating a competitive land market.
And in 1984, the Supreme Court upheld the law. Writing for a unanimous court, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote that breaking up a land oligopoly was a legitimate public purpose.
In Midkiff, the court had the opportunity to characterize the eminent domain as another exception to the public use rule.
That is my colleague Dana Berliner, who is IJ's Senior Vice President and Litigation Director.
Instead, what the court said in Midkiff was anything that seemed like it conceivably could be a good idea, the government could use eminent domain for that project or purpose.
The court could have said that the usual test about what property is used for after the taking and whether it's for public or private use still controls. We made an exception for slums, and now we're making another exception for land oligopolies, resulting from the remnants of an old feudal system that, by the way, is a one-off. Those conditions don't exist in any other state. Instead, the court doubled down on its language in Berman that basically anything that officials might think seems like a good idea is a public purpose. In Justice O'Connor's words, property could be seized and put to private use for anything, quote, rationally related to a conceivable public purpose.
And what that sounded like to people who read it and to the courts that read it was that there really wasn't a public use limit in the Constitution anymore.
Maybe. We'll come back to that.
The court showed absolutely no recognition of the fact that Berman had been a complete disaster, that the federal government had spent billions of dollars to uproot people from their communities and did not actually renew anything.
And ultimately, Midkiff was a failure as well. After the ruling, Hawaii's high cost of living did not abate. According to Professor Gideon Kanner, far from being a take from the rich and give to the poor kind of scheme, actually the beneficiaries of the law were generally well-off suburbanites, a powerful and numerous interest group that legislators wanted to curry favor with. And the law had a dramatic unintended consequence. After the decision, many of the homeowners then sold their properties to foreign investors, who built bigger but not more single-family homes.
Because the law only applied to land that had been subdivided and was only allowed to be single-family homes, there was no possible increase in housing supply. It was always going to be the transfer of the land under the single-family home to another owner of the land under a single-family home.
Last year, the governor of Hawaii declared a state of emergency, noting that the price of housing in the state has skyrocketed over the last 45 years, and placing the blame for that primarily on the state's land use regulations, which, according to the governor, are the most restrictive in the country and which make building homes prohibitively difficult or outright illegal. And he noted, as the landowner did in Midkiff, that the state itself owns a lot of land that could be built on. But back in 1984, instead of doing something that would actually address the housing crisis, the state chose to take property from an unpopular minority who could not protect themselves at the ballot box to give to preferred constituents, the exact dynamic that the Constitution was meant to guard against. Nevertheless, the court deferred. And that's where, at the federal level, things stood until the 1990s, when a merry band of constitutional litigators calling themselves the Institute for Justice arrived on the scene.
When I went to law school, we really didn't learn about public use pretty much at all. So when I got a phone call in 1996 from a friend who had seen an article in the paper about a woman's house that was being taken for Donald Trump's limousine parking lot, I was surprised. I thought to myself, hey, the Constitution says public use, and that doesn't sound like a public use. I think this must be unconstitutional.
In life, you have a thing called condemnation, and cities have the right to condemn for the good of a city.
Vera Koking was an elderly widow who had lived in and operated a boarding house just off the boardwalk in Atlantic City, New Jersey since 1961. Donald Trump wanted it and several nearby businesses to build a parking lot for his casino.
Basic to freedom is that if you own something, it's yours, that the government doesn't just come and take it away from you.
Do you want to live in a city where you can't build schools? Do you want to live in a city where you can't build roads or highways or have access to hospitals? Condemnation is a necessary evil.
And when Vera and the other property owners refused to sell, the Trump organization persuaded officials to condemn the land.
This is a government case. This is not Donald Trump.
Yes, it's Donald Trump. It's you and your cronies in government working together.
For you to call these people cronies is very unfair. To be calling good public servants cronies.
I contacted the lawyer that was representing her and persuaded him that we should co-counsel on the constitutional issue. And then once we were in the case, really began delving much more deeply into the issue of public use. And that's when I discovered just how terrible the law was. What was interesting, though, was all lawyers in the field and all academics at that point believed that there was absolutely nothing left of public use. Not under the federal constitution, not under the state constitution. No one was challenging it. So we at IJ decided this is a huge constitutional issue that has been abandoned by everyone else, and therefore we should be the ones to fight it.
New Jersey law generally required a finding of blight before property could be condemned, but Atlantic City's Casino Reinvestment Development Authority was the exception. Those good public servants could take any property without a blight finding, so long as it benefited a casino, which would then in theory benefit the city. So the authority drew up a contract saying that after it used eminent domain, it would transfer the properties to Trump Hotel and Casino.
What they did not do was ensure in this contract that the land actually would be used for parking and limousine staging. It just transferred it. And as we discovered during our legal research, that's actually a problem.
State law required that whatever the taking was going to be for had to be spelled out in the contract.
The contract doesn't even require that this be limousine staging. So it could be, as soon as it's transferred over, that they do anything else with it. There is no reasonable assurance of future public use. And that argument was successful. Limousine staging for a private casino is not a public use. I firmly believe that. We did not win on that. And that was IJ's introduction into eminent domain.
After that, the phone began to ring off the hook, because it was the 90s and phones were still on hooks.
After we started doing the Vera Koken case, we began getting phone calls all the time. And reporters would ask us, well, how often does this happen? And we would say, well, we heard about a case in this state and a case in that state, so we think it happens a lot. And the reporters would say, yeah, but how often does this happen? Is this actually a big national problem? And we did not have a way to answer that question. We looked for data. It does not exist. We looked for really anything from the court system, from states. Data about eminent domain is not collected.
We have pretty good numbers from the era of urban renewal, but after the federal bulldozer came to a stop, data on how often eminent domain was being used for private redevelopment just did not exist.
So finally, we decided, let's just add up what we can find from newspapers, from court papers that people sent us, just anything, and see what it comes to. And what we found was in 5 years, there were more than 10,000 properties either taken for private use or threatened with condemnation for private use.
Only one state, Connecticut, made it possible to find out how many actual condemnations were taking place and also whether the taking was for a private project rather than for a road or a park.
The data from Connecticut was 543 redevelopment condemnations. In our sources, from newspapers and court papers, we found 31 condemnations for private use.
Which is to say that when we looked at publicly available sources, we found 31 condemnations. But the actual, official, verifiably correct number was 543. Which made us think that the 10,000 condemnations and threatened condemnations we'd found across the country were quite possibly just the tip of a very large iceberg.
What you can find in newspapers is a tiny fraction of what was actually happening.
And what we could find in the newspapers, while certainly not anything like the scale of the urban renewal era when cities were clear-cutting hundreds of acres at a time, was still pretty horrifying.
A city in Texas condemned 10 homes for a shopping center and forced the people to move while the spouses in 2 of those homes were dying of cancer. There was a family home that was condemned in Florida so that the manager of a planned new golf course could live in their house.
In Cincinnati, the city forced a Walgreens to move so that a Nordstrom could open on the site. It then condemned a CVS pharmacy so that the Walgreens could relocate there. And then it condemned several small businesses to relocate the CVS. And after all of that, the Nordstrom's was never built. The site became a parking lot.
The city of Lakewood, Ohio, designated a lovely neighborhood as blighted because the yards were too small and they lacked attached 2-car garages.
In Washington state, an 80-year-old woman was kicked out of her home of over 50 years to improve a sewage facility. But the city instead gave her property to a car dealership. And on. And the phone kept ringing. One call was from Mississippi.
In Mississippi, they allowed eminent domain for economic development for industrial uses. There was no designation of the area as blighted.
Nissan wanted to build an auto manufacturing facility outside of Canton, Mississippi, and the state of Mississippi wanted the jobs and the tax revenues the plant would bring.
It just so happened that there were lots of people's homes there.
Including the Archies, an African-American family whose land had been acquired by a grandfather in the 1930s, a time when that was not an easy thing to do.
They didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of land, and they were very proud that their family had acquired this huge parcel of land. The streets were all named after family members because it was big enough to actually have streets going through it. It was their legacy, and it was something that they really, really valued.
Nissan wanted the Archies' property for a truck staging area where big rigs would be able to come in and turn around. Or at least that's what it looked like on the map. It was hard to tell.
We actually were able to put on trial what the plans were. And it was as I was cross-examining the head of the development authority, we were looking at the map, and it became apparent that the Archies' home was going to be a dead-end street. And the head of the authority admitted, yeah, that is just a dead end. Trucks will be going over this other part, but we don't actually need that dead end. Nothing's going to happen there. And what they were planning to do was to completely displace an entire family that had lived on this property for generations for nothing, just because they thought it was kind of vaguely convenient and maybe they would use it sometime in the future, maybe they wouldn't. And that tells you something about what goes on with eminent domain. People who engage in eminent domain claim that it is a last resort and they would never do it unless they really, really needed it. And that's just a lie.
The trial lasted 18 hours straight, and then, a week later, the judge issued his opinion, which opened with a prayer.
The court, at the end, said a prayer and then allowed the condemnations to go forward, and allowed them to go forward quickly. I personally interpreted this as, God forgive me, but I'm going to let him take your house.
But the Mississippi Supreme Court issued a stay of the condemnations,
which meant they wanted to hear the case, and they were not going to let the home be torn down and the plant be built before they had a chance to decide if this was constitutional under the Mississippi Constitution.
At that point, there were several different claims in play. The court could have ruled that taking property that wasn't necessary for the project was unconstitutional, that the judiciary did not need to defer to state officials about which particular parcels were necessary for the plant. Or it could have ruled more broadly, finding that taking property for a private company was not a public use. Instead, what happened is that the development authority abandoned the condemnations.
They could build it without taking these people's homes, and so they did.
Today, the plant is churning out automobiles.
An exclusive look at new jobs for the largest employer in central Mississippi.
A new vehicle comes off the assembly line here at the Nissan Canton plant every 20 seconds.
And the Archies are still living there after they were able to stay. Many other family members moved on to the land, built their own homes, and it became really a family enclave.
Meanwhile, we looked for other cases to bring up to the Supreme Court on the question that was still left open by Berman. Berman had allowed takings of blighted areas to create jobs and increase the tax base, even if they weren't all that blighted, but were merely in danger of becoming blighted. But what about cases where not even that was true? Could the government throw people out of well-maintained homes simply because a factory or shops or more expensive homes might pay more in taxes?
Now, the U.S. Supreme Court had never ruled on that. Some state courts said economic development is a good enough reason to use eminent domain. Some states that said it wasn't. So we had a split of authority, and then we got a letter about the Kelo situation.
The city of New London, Connecticut was historically home to the whaling industry. In 1781, the city and the fort that guarded it was put to the torch by the British, led by the trader Benedict Arnold. But the fort was rebuilt, and in the late 1990s, the pharmaceutical company Pfizer was set to relocate its R&D headquarters to the neighborhood, bringing thousands of jobs and white-collar workers to the area. To complement Pfizer's arrival, the city wanted private developers to build fancy new offices, a 5-star hotel and conference center, shops, and residences with sweeping riverfront views. The only problem was there was already a neighborhood there.
There were homes, single-family homes, there were apartments, there were a couple small businesses, all within this very cute working-class neighborhood that was on a little peninsula called Fort Trumbull in New London, Connecticut.
And many of the homeowners wanted to stay.
Everyone knew each other and had been there for a significant period of time. There were families that had been there for generations.
They objected on principle to eminent domain for private use. And it wasn't great that the head of the quasi-public agency leading the project, the New London Development Corporation, was married to a top Pfizer executive, which at the very least raised the appearance of impropriety. But also, mostly it was just clear right from the beginning that the city did not need their properties.
The city absolutely could have built what it wanted to build without taking anyone's home away from them.
The project area was 90 acres. The homeowners who wanted to stay all lived in 2 pockets of land that totaled 1.54 acres, which is to say that the city controlled 97% of the land that it wanted to build on. There were no engineering or logistical or any kind of actual reasons why the city couldn't have proceeded with the plan without seizing property. It just came down to the aesthetic preferences of the people calling the shots.
The city wanted something that looked completely modern. It didn't want to have to accommodate older homes. It didn't want the bother of having to work around people who didn't want to leave. It just wanted to raze everything to the ground and build new.
And that's what Pfizer wanted too. At trial, one of the representatives of the New London Development Corporation testified that Pfizer was, quote, the 10,000-pound gorilla in the planning process. Whatever Pfizer asked for was put into the plan. And Pfizer demanded that Fort Trumbull be demolished. Only one property was spared, a private, men's-only social club popular with state politicians.
Pfizer didn't like the way the neighborhood looked. It wanted it to look spiffier and more modern and more upscale. And it told the city that it wanted something else there.
The day before Thanksgiving in the year 2000, the residents of Fort Trumbull received notices posted on their doors that their homes were no longer theirs. They had 3 months, and if they didn't leave, they'd be removed by the police. And in the meantime, the city was going to charge them rent. One of those homeowners was Wilhelmina Derry, who'd been born in her house in 1918. Another was Suzette Kelo, a nurse who'd bought her house several years earlier and renovated it herself.
Suzette had found her dream home. It was on the water. She could actually afford it. It was near where she grew up, and she redid the whole thing herself. It was also the first property that she had owned. And one of the things we've noticed is that when it is the first property that someone has owned, they are very attached to it because it represents more than just a place that they live, but it represents success, independence, and the realization of dreams. And we frequently find that people just don't want to leave those houses.
As it happens, the Pfizer project was not New London's first experience with eminent domain. In the 1960s, during the era of urban renewal, the city knocked down over 500 buildings, demolishing an integrated Polish and Italian neighborhood, just under a quarter of whose residents were black. Later, the city demolished part of the downtown business district.
New London is home. But just look at what's been happening to our home. Blight gnawed unchecked while we looked the other way. Now, in 1962, it can no longer be ignored.
But the Renaissance that had been promised never arrived. By the 1990s, New London had been declared economically distressed by the state. But if city leaders learned any lessons from the failure of urban renewal, they had long since been forgotten.
So we had a trial, and there were 2 sections of the neighborhood that were being taken. One was being taken for something called park support, but no one actually knew what it was. Literally, no witness knew what it was. The others were being taken for an office building that the developer admitted there was no market for and wouldn't be built.
During depositions, the developer of the proposed office space frankly admitted that he was not going to build any offices.
The developer was completely open about the fact that there was no market for it. There were dozens of empty office buildings in New London. There was no need for this office building. And I think, truthfully, the developer was in the process of pulling out of the project. It was obvious from the start that they were never going to build anything. And they didn't.
The city had produced an array of official-sounding and unbelievably specific projections for how many jobs would be created and how much tax revenue would be generated.
None of it panned out. But the courts actually just didn't care about that at all. Not the trial court, not the Connecticut Supreme Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court. No one was interested in the fact that there would be no project.
In the trial court, the judge ruled in favor of some of the property owners. He ruled that the properties intended for so-called park support could not be condemned because in reality, there was no plan for how they would be used, and therefore no assurance that they would be put to public use.
As to the office building area, office building is kind of a public use, so okay, you can take that.
And not just an office building, but an office building that would not be built was a public use.
Both sides appealed. The Connecticut Supreme Court then split 4-3, ruling everything could be condemned. Economic development is a public use under the Connecticut Constitution. Go forth and condemn.
And then the Supreme Court took up the case. In many ways, it was the perfect case. It gave the court a chance to take stock and acknowledge that urban renewal had been a disaster. Before Berman, everyone involved had taken for granted that redevelopment was a sure thing. With modern planning, cities would surely be renewed. By the time of Kelo, however, it was clear not only did redevelopment in general fail to materialize, but also that the very project in the case in front of the court was not going to materialize. Finally, 60 years after Berman v. Parker, 20 years after Midkiff, the court had a chance to finally draw a line and say, this far, but no farther. The public use requirement still has some teeth.
We will now hear argument in the case of Kelo versus City of New London. Mr. Bullock.
Justice O'Connor, and may it please the court.
That is IJ President and Chief Counsel Scott Bullock, who back in 2005 was just a dashing young lawyer who litigated a number of IJ's eminent domain cases with Dana.
This case is about whether there are any limits on government's eminent domain power under the public use requirement of the Fifth Amendment. Every home, church, or corner store would produce more tax revenue and jobs if it were a Costco, a shopping mall, or a private office building.
Mr. Bullock, you're leaving out that New London was in a depressed economic condition, and they wanted to build it up, get more jobs.
At oral argument, there was a clear split between justices who wanted to spell out some limit on the meaning of public use.
I just want to take property from people who are paying less taxes and give it to people who are paying more taxes. That'd be a public use, wouldn't it?
For example, Motel 6. And the city thinks, well, if we had a Ritz-Carlton, we'd have higher taxes. Now, is that okay?
Yes, Your Honor. That would be okay.
And those who didn't.
Justice Douglas says there that as long as it's objective within Congress or the legislature's legitimate grant of power, they can do it. So why does there have to be a limit within that broad limit?
Well, Your Honor, the limit is that there cannot be takings for private use.
No, of course there can't. Purely, but there is no taking for private use that you could imagine in reality that wouldn't also have a public benefit of some kind, whether it's increasing jobs or increasing taxes, etc. Now, that's a fact of the world. Why shouldn't the law say, okay, virtually every taking is all right, as long as there's some public benefit, which there always is, and it's up to the legislature.
In his closing rebuttal, Scott tried to get the court to focus on the consequences of what would happen if the court ruled against Suzette and her neighbors.
I think the key to understanding their argument is the answer to the question of, can you take a Motel 6 and give it to a fancier hotel? Their answer is yes. And that's what's really at stake here. The one thing that all poor neighborhoods share in common is that they don't produce much in the way of tax revenue. So you're going to put poor neighborhoods and working class neighborhoods like the ones that exist in Fort Trumbull in jeopardy if the court affirms the decision below.
But in June of 2005, by a vote of 5-4, the court said economic development is a public use. In an opinion written by Justice Stevens, the court ruled that the private benefits to Pfizer and to the developer the city selected to rebuild Fort Trumbull were just incidental.
New London's effort to rejuvenate its economy through an integrated development plan qualifies as a public purpose.
Because New London officials had thoroughly deliberated over the development plan before adopting it, the court said it was entitled to deference. Just as the court had done in Euclid with zoning and in Berman with urban renewal, the court deferred to the planning process.
We give deference to the city's considered judgment that its plan was needed to breathe life into its ailing economy.
What Stevens said, essentially, is that the courts aren't in the business of figuring out whether takings comply with the Constitution or not. If the city went through a process, if it decided that whatever it was doing was for a public purpose, then the court would defer to that finding.
And there was a lot of process.
They had a big, huge stack of paper that looked like they did a large process. And they did. They had lots of meetings. They talked to developers. They had lots of plans. They held lots of hearings at which the citizens came and begged them not to do this, and they didn't listen.
It is not within our authority as a court to determine the plan's likelihood of success, nor to determine whether New London would have been wiser to pursue economic development in some other way.
The majority said it was deferring to a comprehensive, integrated development plan. It was not, it said, approving a mere one-off taking of property outside of a planning process.
It sounded sort of like if there had been a single beneficiary and a single property taken, maybe, possibly, the court would say that that was a taking from A to B, and it was actually for private use. Perhaps it would. But the way that it was written, any mildly competent city would be able to come up with a plan and create a whole bunch of hoops that it could then jump through and create a lot of paper. And according to the Supreme Court, that would completely satisfy the Constitution.
The court also said that it was merely following precedent that was even older than Berman. Precedent that said that the meaning of public use is whatever the legislature says it is.
For over a century, our cases have shown deference to state legislatures in determining what public needs justify the use of the takings power.
And it said that eminent domain had long been used to promote economic development.
Economic development is a traditional and long-accepted function of government. For example, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this court approved the taking of lands needed to facilitate agriculture and mining in the western states.
For those propositions, the court cited two main cases, one of which we talked about last episode. In Dayton Gold and Silver Mining v. Sewell from 1876, the Nevada Supreme Court had ruled that the mining industry was crucial to the creation and survival of the state, and so private mining interests could enjoy the benefits of eminent domain, as that would provide jobs and tax revenue. But the condemnation in the case, which the court allowed, was for a road, the taking of a narrow strip of land leading to the entrance of a mine. According to the Nevada Supreme Court, its reasoning would not allow for condemnations for ordinary private uses of property, like hotels and theaters. It's an example of a court saying, as they did so often in the late 1800s, that we'll allow condemnation for the benefit of a private party this one time further, but seriously, we really mean it, there are limits, lest eminent domain be, quote, used as an instrument of oppression. Another case the court cited, Strictly v. Highland Boy Mining Company, came from Utah, where instead of a road, a mining company had installed a temporary aerial bucket line to carry ore and materials suspended in the air from the entrance of a mine 2 miles down a rocky hillside to a railway station, held up by 4 towers along the way. In 1906, in a 2-page opinion by Justice Holmes, the Supreme Court upheld the taking. All of which is to say that if the court wanted to draw a line in Kelo between partial and temporary takings to create rights of way and the taking of entire neighborhoods, it probably could have.
There were plenty of lines that the court could have drawn. The court didn't want to draw any lines. It just said state legislatures and cities can do what they want, and we're not going to interfere.
To the 4 justices who dissented, the majority ruling effectively deleted the public use requirement from the Constitution. All 4 joined a dissent written by Justice O'Connor, who of course was the author of the court's unanimous opinion in Midkiff, one of her first opinions for the court. In Kelo, one of her last opinions, she wrote that both Berman and Midkiff contained, quote, errant language that went beyond what was necessary to decide those cases and that wrongly allowed for eminent domain for virtually any reason, even, quote, aesthetic pleasure.
Any property may now be taken for the benefit of another private party, but the fallout from this decision will not be random. The beneficiaries are likely to be those citizens with disproportionate influence and power in the political process, including large corporations and development firms. As for the victims, the government now has license to transfer property from those with fewer resources to those with more. The founders cannot have intended this perverse result.
Full disclosure, Justice O'Connor did not read her dissent from the bench. We were able to produce what you just heard with the assistance of AI. We've never done that before, and if we ever do it again, we will always disclose it. Anyhow, Justice Thomas also wrote a dissent.
The Thomas dissent looks at what did public use mean at the time that those words were written, and then what would that mean today?
Justice Thomas went further than the other dissenters and argued that both Berman and Midkiff were outright wrong. Public use means what it meant at the founding, that after a taking, the property either had to be owned by the public or open to use by the public. And he wrote that cases decided even earlier than Berman were wrong. Specifically, that the practice of courts deferring to legislators on just what counts as a public use was unjustified, and also never sufficiently explained. It had been adopted as dicta, that is, in cases where it was unnecessary to the reasoning or the outcome, and then later it was applied in cases like the Utah aerial bucket case, where it was the critical issue, with, quote, little discussion and by barren citation. And Justice Thomas reminded the majority of the consequences to minority communities from urban renewal, invoking the line we mentioned last episode from James Baldwin, who called it, quote, Negro removal.
Thomas's emphasis on looking at the original meaning and the history is very much in keeping with the court's current approach to a lot of constitutional questions, where it is attempting to return to original meaning, history, tradition. At the time of Kelo, Thomas was very interested in historical meaning, but many of the other members of the court were not.
After the Supreme Court's decision, the city's vision for Fort Trumbull did not come to pass. The neighborhood was razed to the ground, but the land remained vacant for years, home only to a colony of feral cats. And only a few years after it arrived, Pfizer left too.
The state and the city had lured Pfizer by a package of incentives, tax breaks, and the promise to redevelop this part of Fort Trumbull. Eventually, the city and the state thought Pfizer would be very happy and it would remain. Instead, what happened is that the second that the tax breaks ran out and Pfizer was going to have to pay an ordinary level of taxes, it closed down its plant and moved.
In the past few years, there has been some activity in Fort Trumbull. A submarine company has moved into Pfizer's old headquarters outside the project area, again with a generous package of state subsidies. Inside the project area, the city has begun construction on a taxpayer-funded community center, which sounds very nice, but won't generate any tax revenue. In 2022, the city finally sold its first piece of land in the project area to a private developer who plans to build a hotel, but that project is stalled and construction has not yet begun. More recently, the city approved plans for new apartments. So we'll see. The city spent over $70 million in public funds to destroy the neighborhood. Maybe someday new people will live there and they'll pay some taxes. But it's going to be a while before the city breaks even on its investment. As for the former property owners, Wilhelmina Derry, who was born in her home in 1918, died there a few months after the Supreme Court's decision. And Suzette Kelo's house was preserved by a local historic preservationist. It was disassembled and put back together in another part of New London, where it serves as a monument to her and her neighbors' struggle and the impact it had on the country. Because that is not the end of the story. Unlike after the Berman decision, the public response to Kelo was a massive outpouring of disapproval, with opinion polls finding that 80 to 90% opposed the decision. After he retired, Justice Stevens himself, though he continued to believe it was correctly decided, said it was the most unpopular opinion he ever wrote in his 3 decades on the court.
As soon as Kelo came down, IJ started getting calls from state legislators all across the country. And so there began a period of very rapid legislative backlash.
Some states amended their state constitutions. Other states changed their laws,
reforming them to prevent eminent domain for economic development. Some states went farther and narrowed their definitions of blight, or they made other procedural changes. Some states did not go as far as they should have, but still made eminent domain for private development somewhat more difficult.
And several state Supreme Courts rejected Kelo, including the Ohio Supreme Court, where IJ represented the homeowners. In the case of Norwood v. Horney, the court not only declared that economic development was not a public use, but it also pushed back against Berman and ruled that for a neighborhood to be designated as blighted, there had to actually be blight. Declaring a neighborhood of well-maintained homes blighted simply because it had inadequate street layout, faulty lot arrangement, or diversity of ownership, or any of the other planning jargon that we discussed on the last episode, would no longer cut it.
And if you add up all of the state legislatures and the state courts, 47 states made it at least somewhat more difficult to use eminent domain for private projects. And I would say at least half of those really did make it substantially more difficult.
Within a few years of the Kelo decision, our phones stopped ringing off the hook about eminent domain abuse. Not completely, but for a while there just wasn't much going on. Part of that was no doubt because of the Great Recession in 2008, which put a damper on construction. But even after the recession, and even in states where the law remained permissive, things were pretty quiet. Until recently.
We're seeing a resurgence now because all of the people that were in power at the time are gone. And developers are once again pressing to get inexpensive and desirable land for private development. But the people who are in power don't remember what happened the last time this was tried.
And once again, for the first time in years, at the Institute for Justice, we have a hefty docket of eminent domain cases on a variety of issues. Firstly, we're asking the Supreme Court to enforce what the majority in Kelo said was still left of the Public Use Clause, a ban on so-called pretextual takings, where the true purpose of the taking is something other than what the government is claiming. For instance, if the taking is for the benefit of a single private party outside the auspices of a comprehensive planning process. At oral argument in Kelo, Justice Souter raised the example of a mayor seizing property just to give it to a political ally.
I can understand perfectly well why we want to draw a distinction between the use of the eminent domain power that takes a parcel of property from private person A and simply then reconveys it to private person B without any particular object in mind except that the city likes B. The mayor's a Democrat and B's a Democrat.
Another kind of pretextual taking are cases where officials' stated purpose for a taking is actually a traditional public use where the public will own the property afterward. But in fact, the true purpose of the taking is to punish, harass, or retaliate against someone they don't like. Right now, we're asking the Supreme Court to take up just such a case.
Good morning, Your Honors, and may it please the Court. I'm Jeff Redfern from the Institute for Justice. I'm here on behalf of the Brinkman appellants. My clients want to operate a lawful business on land that they owned, complies with every regulation, they've paid every fee, they've jumped through every hoop.
That is my colleague Jeffrey Redfern, arguing last year before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Our clients are two brothers who want to open a hardware store in the town of Southold, New York, on Long Island. They own property that is zoned for such a store, and they have spent years and tens of thousands of dollars meeting all of the town's numerous land use requirements. But at the end of the process, rather than issuing them a building permit, the town decided it doesn't like them, or it doesn't want a hardware store, or whatever the reason, they filed a condemnation action. And they say they're going to use the property as a, quote, passive park, which means essentially that it's going to be left vacant. But the Brinkmans have overwhelming evidence that the town doesn't actually care about having a park. It's all just a pretext.
This property was not on the 957 property list of properties that have been targeted for possible acquisition for parks and open space. That's remarkable. It's a small town. It didn't even make the top 1,000.
In the years they spent going back and forth with the town, no one ever mentioned that a park was being contemplated for their property. In fact, the town had actually produced a list of 957 properties it would consider acquiring for a park, and their property was not on the list. Moreover, the property next to their property is for sale and is substantially the same. The park could go there tomorrow without any need to spend years litigating eminent domain. But in court, the town argued that none of that matters, that if officials don't like someone, they can condemn their home or their business as long as they use it for a park.
The mere fact is they said they're building a park, and that's the end of the analysis.
That's correct.
At oral argument, Judge Menashe of the Second Circuit asked the town's lawyer if instead of stopping the construction of a store, what if the town was using its power to harass minorities?
So the town says, we don't want African Americans and Jews in our town, so we're just going to take all their houses and build public parks on top of them to drive them out of town. And they actually do build the public parks. Would that be a taking for public use?
Incredibly, the town's lawyer said yes.
We don't want Jews in our town. We're going to seize all their houses and put parks on top of them. That would be a taking for public use.
I think under this court's precedent, where we don't go and explore the subjective motivation of every legislature who is involved, and where the real recourse in the event that the legislature was doing that would be the political process.
The recourse would be the political process. Let's say there are only 5 Jews in the town, and they've just seized their houses and driven them out of town. I mean, how are they going to have recourse in the political process against that?
Unfortunately, earlier this year, over a dissent from Judge Menashe, the Second Circuit ruled in favor of the town. It held that government officials can destroy anyone's property as long as they're willing to lie about why they're doing it. Further, it means that even after a municipality's very broad authority to regulate land use has run out, officials still have final, unreviewable, unwritten, ad hoc authority to then turn to eminent domain if they don't get their way. Other courts have ruled differently, and we think the Supreme Court should resolve the split. And we're also pursuing eminent domain cases that don't really implicate Kelo or public use. Instead, they are about the process that's due in eminent domain proceedings. For instance, last year, the city of Ocean Springs, Mississippi, passed a resolution creating an urban renewal area and declaring that a huge section of the city was a slum, including the downtown and essentially the entirety of the city's one historically black neighborhood.
As far as we can tell, there wasn't a blight study in Ocean Springs. I think the most they've produced is a single-page letter that says this neighborhood is blighted. There's no study. There's no analysis of the parcels. It was the most threadbare blight declaration, at least I've seen in my entire life.
That is Robert McNamara, IJ's Deputy Litigation Director.
There was zero effort put forth to actually prove that this was blighted, that this met any of the blight criteria under Mississippi law. It was just an assertion. So if it were challenged in Mississippi state court, I would expect the city to lose in pretty short order.
But the blight designation was not challenged because no one knew about it.
But the crazy thing is, when they announced this, it was already too late for anyone who lived in the neighborhood to do anything about it. Ocean Springs had decided to blight this property at a hearing where they didn't tell anyone what was going on, that they were losing any rights, or even that they could attend. And that's because Mississippi law, at least as it's written, allows a city to declare property blighted without providing any notice of the blight declaration, and then says if you don't sue within 10 days from that designation, you have waived your right to challenge it forever.
Which is a due process problem. If the government is going to take your life, your liberty, or your property, it has to give you fair notice and a meaningful chance to contest the deprivation of your rights. We are representing the owners of homes, businesses, and a church in the neighborhood in federal court to vindicate due process. In other cases, we are asking courts to follow the Ohio Supreme Court in reining in Berman v. Parker and to reject bogus declarations of blight. For instance, recently officials in Brentwood, Missouri, labeled 75 buildings in their downtown area blighted.
Brentwood, Missouri is a suburb of St. Louis that has spent a significant amount of money over the past several years repairing and upgrading streets and drainage in its downtown area. And despite the fact that it spent all this money improving the area, essentially out of nowhere, it declared a big strip of its downtown business district to be blighted. And this strip isn't blighted. The buildings are fine. The businesses are fine. It seems very much like what Brentwood means when it says this area is blighted is that somebody else wants this area, that it would love to turn this area over to private developers to build something else.
One common theme that we notice time after time in the blight cases that IJ has litigated is that very often a developer or a city will buy properties in a neighborhood targeted for redevelopment and let them deteriorate, creating the very conditions they purport to want to solve. And Brentwood is no exception. The city owns lots of property downtown. Much of it is being left vacant. And if the definition of blight is, as the city argues, just that a property could be bringing in more tax revenues, well, then the city is the entity creating the blight in Brentwood. But that's not what the law says that blight is.
But blight means something real under Missouri law. You have to be able to prove that the area is dangerous, that there's something wrong with it. So IJ has teamed up with a group of local business owners who want to say that their businesses are perfectly fine and that there's no good reason for their property to be taken away from them and turned over to a private developer.
And just as an aside, some of the states that undertook meaningful legislative reform after Kelo, like for instance Pennsylvania, one of the things that they did was to say that blight designations have to focus on individual properties. No more taking entire neighborhoods just because of a few problem properties. That solves the problem of cities and developers creating blight to justify eminent domain.
There are some jurisdictions where blight means anything the government wants it to mean, where blighted really can just be a synonym for coveted. And Missouri isn't one of those jurisdictions, and we're asking the courts to confirm that it's a jurisdiction where you can only take blighted property when you have actual evidence and a good reason to say that it's blighted.
We're also asking courts to repudiate the idea that just because a public agency that's condemning property says it's doing it for public use, that that's a declaration that must be deferred to. Unfortunately, that's a tough sell in federal court, given the century-plus of bad precedent that Justice Thomas talked about in his dissent in Kelo. But state courts don't have to follow that. And some state courts can't follow that.
In the wake of Kelo, Texas adopted a really strong constitutional amendment that makes abundantly clear that you can't use eminent domain for the purpose of economic development. And that's what the port is doing.
In 2020, the Port Authority in Freeport, Texas, filed a condemnation action against homes owned by our clients, the Marshall family, in a historically African-American section of town. The Marshalls had lived there since the 1940s, when, because of redlining, it was the only place in town they could live. Today, the port is clear-cutting the entire neighborhood.
And it emerged over the course of the case that they are taking this land for effectively nothing. Their plan is to take this property and then see if anyone else wants it. See if there are any private businesses that might be interested in putting private businesses where these homes used to be.
Unfortunately, the Marshalls' homes and the homes of many other people have already been bulldozed. It didn't come out until years into the litigation that the port doesn't know what it's going to do with the properties. So what we're asking for is for the land to be restored to the Marshalls, plus money damages for the destruction of their houses. And finally, we are also trying to overturn Kelo. In the case of Bowers v. Oneida County Industrial Development Agency, we are representing Mr. Bowers, who is a developer who owns land next to a hospital in Utica, New York, where he intends to build a medical office building. He knows a bunch of doctors who would like to rent office space from him. All the relevant land use requirements are met. The only problem is that the owners of an existing medical office building nearby do not want the competition.
Brian Bowers, who purchased some land near a hospital in upstate New York and started planning to build an office building, when the existing office building went to the local industrial development authority and said, hey, we, as the existing office building, need a new parking lot. And you know the land we'd like for our new parking lot turns out to be exactly the land where Brian wants to build a competing office building. And the Industrial Development Agency said, great, we'd love to take that person's property and turn it over to you.
This scenario is the exact thing the majority in Kelo said might still be left of the public use requirement. It's a piecemeal taking, a one-for-one transfer from A to B for B's private gain. There are no airs being put on that it's part of some well-thought-out and carefully planned redevelopment scheme.
You have one private entity that went to the government and said, please give me the property that belongs to that other private entity. And the government said, okay. And the New York courts said, that's fine.
At this moment, New York's highest court, the Court of Appeals, is considering whether to review the case. Whatever they decide, we expect that the case will wind up before the U.S. Supreme Court, which will then have the opportunity to say that at the very least, even under Kelo, this taking is unconstitutional. And they could say a little more.
So this tees up exactly the question that was left open by Kelo of what counts as a pretextual taking. And it also opens an opportunity for the Supreme Court just to say, you know what, Kelo was wrong in the first place. We made a mistake in Kelo. State court after state court has decided that Kelo isn't a workable rule under their own constitutions, and it's time to reconsider the breadth of that opinion.
And that brings us to the end of our look at the power of eminent domain. Hopefully, the Supreme Court is finally ready to put some limits on that power. And if not, there's plenty of work to be done in state court. Ultimately, I think what we're asking the courts to do, both state and federal, is to do what the Supreme Court did all the way back in 1917, in the case of Buchanan v. Worley, one of the very finest rights-protecting decisions of all time. We talked about the case on episode 3. There, the city of Louisville listed all manner of reasons why imposing residential segregation would be a great thing. It would protect property values and prevent racial violence. It would prevent the spread of disease, and more. But the Supreme Court said, as much as you would like to further those goals, you cannot do it by denying rights protected by the Constitution. Simple as that. And that's what the court should say in more cases. Trying to make cities and towns and neighborhoods lively and beautiful and clean and safe. Improving the tax base. These are all worthy enough, but they do not provide justification for stripping people of their right to own and use property. I'm John Ross, and that's all for now. When we return on the next episode, we'll return again to the subject of the government taking property that it shouldn't. By which I mean civil forfeiture, the government's practice of seizing and then keeping property that is merely suspected of being involved in a crime.
In civil asset forfeiture, the government can seize your property upon the weakest, most flimsy, diaphanous charge. What is also unbelievable is that unless you take action in court, you can't get your property back. They don't have to convict you. They don't have to even charge you with a crime.
Thanks for listening to Bound by Oath. Bound by Oath is a production of the Institute for Justice's Center for Judicial Engagement. This project was edited by Cassa Lee and Charles Lipper at Volubility Podcasting. The theme music is by Patrick Giacomo. Clips from oral argument at the Supreme Court come from Oye. We relied on the scholarship of Gideon Canner, Anna Vallier, and David Callies. If you want to learn more about urban renewal in New London, students from Connecticut College have put together a website called Mapping Urban Renewal in New London that we'll link to in the show notes.